Hi everyone, Jeff Gianola with KOIN Conversations, and my special guest is a guy that I've known for years. He's a good friend of mine. He's not only a veteran news photographer, he is a veteran historian when it comes to the movie theaters of Portland and film itself. It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Gary Locker. Gary, it's great to have you here. I invited you here because you and a partner, Steve Stone, wrote this book a few years ago, The Theaters of Portland. And I am fascinated by this because all of us in our childhood recall, the movie theaters we went to, especially people of our age, when the movie theaters were like golden palaces. They were places we went to escape. And I thought maybe we'd begin with some of the theaters Portlanders might remember in downtown. Now, of course, a lot of those theaters are no longer here, right?
That's correct. Mm-hmm.
Which theaters were sort of the places where Portlanders gathered at that are no longer here downtown?
Well, it was pretty spread out. One of the ones that friends of mine talked about was the Orpheum Theater. That was on Broadway. And it was torn down when I first got here in 1976. But of course, there were lots of other theaters. The Broadway was still here. That would be considered, a substantial show house. Others, the Liberty, Pantages, all pretty well symbolize the downtown theaters.
And Gary, these were theaters that were decorated. They spent millions decorating these theaters, didn't they?
Oh yeah, they were show places. These were the places that people could come downtown and feel part of something important. They could leave their normal day-to-day working lives, go downtown and enter this palace with fountains and gargoyles, all these things.
It was always a lot of Moorish architecture or Arabian architecture, especially the beautiful Art Deco architecture that we see in so many great old theaters.
That's correct. And furnishings, couches, lounges. It was pretty much a total experience for people.
Let's talk about one of the big theaters downtown that's no longer with us, but that was the Fox Theater. Now the Fox Tower stands at where that was. You actually did a little film on when they tore down that old Fox Theater, but what kind of theater was the Fox Theater? It didn't start off as the Fox, did it?
No, it was a large, it was a high-leg theater, and it started as a substantial vaudeville show place, plays, operas. They would show little short films, novelties, but it then evolved when that was dying out. Then it evolved more into movies. Went through some hard times in the early 30s, then became the Mayfair Theater, and that was basically your downtown movie show house. And then in the 50s, I think around 1954, the Fox Corporation got involved and renamed it the Fox Theater and modeled it after their chain of theaters, including the Marquee, the works, the artwork, and everything. And then they went big, installed CinemaScope. They even had an entourage come in called the CinemaScope Special.
Oh, that was some movie stars came in?
Yeah, they came in by plane.
You have a picture of that in the book, don't you?
Yeah, the CinemaScope Special. They flew in by plane and had a huge parade downtown. That was, things like that, pretty well much like the Rose Festival parade. It was huge. And then it remained as the Fox all throughout into the 60s and 70s, and then just kind of died out and was eventually torn down.
I think was it torn down in the 90s, wasn't it?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And then you documented the destruction of the Fox. That must have, for someone who loves theaters like you do, that must have been very sad to watch.
Well, what was interesting is we got a chance to go in there a couple of years actually before that, so we were able to reveal some of the hidden areas. It was covered up when they converted it to the Fox, And so a lot of the ceilings and the very top balcony section was covered up. But that's where, interestingly, a lot of minorities, African Americans, were sent up a side entrance, if you can believe it, up to the very top rafters, bleachers, and they would be sent there to watch the movie. So it's really part of history. Yeah.
I mean, even part of our ugly history, the
Absolutely.
segregation, which we saw even here in Portland,
Yes.
where black theater patrons had to go to the upper balcony area.
Yes, that's true.
Now, was that true for other theaters as well?
I'm not sure. We don't have any record of that in some of the largest, but since the Fox was so huge, and it was at the time in the teens and into the 20s, but of course that was all covered up and never really talked about or known about for years, even in probably the 40s or 50s.
And you documented the destruction of the Fox.
Yes.
But you said that it seems in every city, including Portland, there's at least one great downtown theater that we've preserved over the years. And in Portland, that would be the Paramount, or now called the Portland Theater. Give us a little history of that.
Well, it was built as the Portland Theater, one of the large examples during the 20s, typical of in a city. And then Paramount Public Corporation bought it in the early 30s, named it the Paramount. And then that's what it existed as all through, I believe, until into the 70s. And then it went on uncertain times. And like in most cities, that theater, luckily, was saved and renovated and turned into a performing arts center, luckily. And that is one of the examples of many cities where this renaissance happened, like the Fox Theater in Atlanta, other cities. So that was a very good period where we were luckily able to save one, maybe two, of the older theater palaces.
And they, I think I recall when they took down the old Paramount sign, I think they dropped it.
Yes, it fell over. It fell over. Well, yeah, and it was quite a story in itself. But they were actually renovating the sign. Yes. They changed it to the Portland. Yeah, which is what it was originally.
Fox, Paramount. This was the day and age when the actual movie companies owned some movie houses, right?
Yes. That was the big thing that caused the palaces to be built. In the 20s, the major studios wanted to show their films and to guarantee they would have their theaters to show their films. And this is when the studios were making, 50 features a year. And eventually they were sold off. And then, of course, many didn't survive. But luckily, the studios was the force behind, like Fox, Paramount, Lowe's Incorporated, which was MGM. So, that was part of the reason that those theaters were built.
Well, some of the most important theaters were the neighborhood theaters, and we had quite a few neighborhood theaters in Portland, but let's begin with, in the Northeast Portland, probably the best known one that's still here, the Hollywood Theater.
Yes. The Hollywood Theater, which its 100th anniversary is coming up, was the idea that in the large Portland neighborhoods, there were a number that were proposed. The Hollywood Theater, which was built in 1926, which is well covered as far as photographs and everything. They went through a very interesting period. They were just at the end of silent film, so for the first year of their existence, they actually had an 8-piece staff orchestra that would play for films. But the next year, Vitaphone and Movietone were the two sound systems coming out. So the Hollywood had to go to those formats. And then, much later on, the Hollywood also experienced quite a revolution. In the late 50s, they went to a process called Cinemiracle, which one film, Windjammer, and they installed 3 projectors in one booth with mirrors and a huge screen, not to be confused with Cinerama. Then they went briefly to 70 millimeter, which is what they have now, but that was the big Todd A.O. type format. Then Cinerama brought it out and then completely refabricated the theater, covered it up, and made the modern Cinerama at that point with the 3 projectors. So all within a space of 3 or 4 years, it went through this technical revolution. And so today, we do see some elements of the original Hollywood, but because Cinerama did such a good job of covering everything up, it's really hard. It's sort of a hybrid. You know, you have some of the walls show the ornate older things. But so it has really survived, meeting all the demands and requirements for showmanship through the years.
Let's talk about some of the other theaters. And you told me the Baghdad Theater is very important because the McMenamins have done a fabulous job of renovating it. You say out of all the old theaters, it's more like it would be from its original days, right?
Yes. The Baghdad, the McMenamins did a terrific job at great effort and expense, I'm sure. But the Baghdad, which again evolved from the 20s and the Arabian, that style of theater, which began with silent films too. But they were also eventually, and I'm not sure when, but converted into at least one theater in the balcony, I forget which. And so to have the 2 theaters, and then they built one backstage behind. So they had at least 3 going. And then the main auditorium was still there. Well, the McMenamins, when they got it, they brought it back, took away the wall and the upstairs theater, and opened the whole thing up to what it was like in the 20s. And as I mentioned, to their effort, today, if you walked in the Baghdad, you would experience almost identical that someone would have experienced in the 20s walking in there, and including the lobby, the lighting, the whole atmosphere. So that's very commendable. That's really good.
And we've got some other little neighborhood theaters that have survived. I think the Avalon is near there. I think of some other theaters, the Clinton. Out of all those little theaters that we have left, and we don't have many, do you have a particular favorite?
Well, I must remind that Portland had as many as 72 movie theaters showing films in 1914 because it grew with the industry. The films came out, and it was the only real place for people to go. And the neighborhoods had all these theaters, not necessarily just little storefront. So they came and went. And then in the 20s, the neighborhood started getting much more substantial 500-seat theaters like the Oregon Theater would have been at that time, the Bob White. And so they were pretty substantial. And then I would say the theater today you can go into that is pretty much close to the same configuration for the small neighborhood theater is the Clinton. The Clinton actually, his entrance was on the street side, not in the corner like it is now. And it's very, very modest. You'd walk in and you were practically in the auditorium. There was only one restroom. My gosh, the panel curtains, but they're still there. And that has survived. So, and they also have, as Portland has done, connected with the community so well, it's caused them to survive, as no other city I know of has done so, that has so many of them The Laurelhurst, for example, has a magnificent neon front. The Moreland Theater is another one that is very accurate to what it was like in the 20s, and I'd like to credit them for really keeping up the good work in a single screen theater. The Cinemagic, 1914, you'd never believe it because of its size. Those guys have done a terrific job in connecting with the community. So we're very lucky. Portland, actually, to be in Portland is probably the luckiest place to be when it comes to connecting with movies.
And in the old theaters. So these theaters have survived, but actually some of the theaters, more than 70 you said, they aren't there. The buildings that used to house these theaters are still there.
Yes.
I like to tell this story of when you were a news photographer and I'd be working with you. We'd be driving to a news store and sometimes you would stop or you would point out to me, Jeff, you see that building right there? And I'd say, yeah. He goes, that used to be the such and such theater. Mm-hmm. And you can tell, look where the marquee, and as I look at that, you could start to imagine that as a theater. I guess that's like theater archaeology. You really used to like doing that. And you kind of explored some of these old buildings where the theaters were.
Let's talk about exploration. We found the blueprints for what was the Woodlawn Theater, which was built never saw sound. And speaking of renovation, these dance companies, ballet companies have taken over these buildings and brought them back to life. And so when you and I'd spot an old auto body garage, and sure, that was the Star Theater from 1912. And Steve Stone, my friend, co-author of the book, who has sadly passed away a couple months ago, he and I would go into these and try to look for anything. It's like going into a pyramid or something. Flashlight. Oh, there's where a light fixture was, or and now it's at some auto body garage. Things like that. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and we talk about nowadays when you go to the movies, people now refuse to go to the theater unless it have those Barco loungers that you can with your feet going up, and it's such a different experience now. But back then, you think about it, I guess there was radio was kind of in its infancy. I mean, at times, but television really hadn't hit yet. These truly were places where you came together as a community, right? It was a communal watching.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Well, the thing with the theaters, and by the way, you mentioned seating. We've seen seats from the older theaters, and they're much narrower and smaller.
Yeah. What's happened to people?
What's going on here? They barely fit in these old seats, but. Let's see, what were we talking about?
It's a communal experience when you go to the theater.
Well, here's the thing. When you went to a theater in those days, all up through the 40s and even the 50s, you knew the manager, he knew you, he may have gone to your church, and you were greeted by, it was a personable thing to begin with. And then you would be, if you saw a movie, even today, if you ask anybody what a certain movie they saw, they will not only remember the film, but they'll remember where they saw it, who they were with, and even where they sat. And, that kind of experience kind of envelopes the whole idea of togetherness and sharing. I don't know how people feel today, what they're sharing. But.
I think there's a little bit of that. I mean, look how they said VHS when that came out, then DVDs. Oh, we're not going to have to go to the theater anymore. People still want to see something on the big screen, but I think people still kind of maybe subconsciously want to share that as a group. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's it. There's still a dynamics. Actually, like the Star Wars experience, the buzz going around about whether it was Jaws, there's no doubt there's still that energy. I'm sure Taylor Swift concert films or something.
Oh, yeah.
And I do feel it, when I go to films that are, even to Hollywood, where they're showing something new or a revival, there is that sense of together energy and what's happening now. And by the way, excuse me, the theaters now are again in their resurgence to push for showmanship. So they're trying, and now IMAX, 70 millimeter IMAX, just pouring it on. Maybe to me it might be going overboard, but still, the theaters are still giving efforts to try to keep people into the theaters. Of course, the content is important, and but I've seen some good presentations lately too. The Hollywood, for example, if something's available in 70 millimeter, by God, they'll show it that way, and they'll make sure people know it. They promote that. In days when you had bookings, reservations to see Sound of Music, reservations to see Cinerama. So, it's getting people away from streaming or TV sets still, I think, prevails.
And back then, going to the movies, even when I was a kid, really in the early 60s, I think, more than after the mid-60s, but theaters usually showed two films, and my mom would just drop us off at the theater. You joined the movies as they were happening.
Oh, yes.
You didn't really go there from the beginning. Now it's like, what time does the movie start? Back then it was sort of like, hey, you go to the movie and you're halfway through the second movie and you stay for the first movie and then you watch half of the second movie you missed and then you just get up from your seat. And that was accepted. And I don't know if this is true, correct me on this, but they said Alfred Hitchcock changed that with Psycho, saying in 1960, saying you have to come at the appointed time, you know, that and people are like, oh, and then after that sort of set that standard of you just don't show up and go in the movie. You come at a time so you don't miss the movie from the beginning. But back when I was a kid, it was like, yeah, whatever, you pick it up halfway through,
Well, the famous line was, "This is where we came in."
Yes.
How many times have I heard that in a theater? And you're right. I can remember in one of the large theaters, they have ropes. And people in the lobby, they're waiting, and somebody would come out of the auditorium, and the usher would say, "Are you leaving?" And then they'd let another person in the auditorium. So it must have been a full house. But you're right. People kind of, just came and went. I remember one theater in St. Paul had 3 features, and we'd just come in the middle of the first one and leave in the middle of the third one. It was, but Psycho, which I vividly recall in its first run, definitely, there were gimmicks too. Do not come in, and they had nurses in case you were going to watch Mom and Dad, and they've always had promotion. Yeah,
they used to give away dishes. A lot of movie theaters.
That was the other thing. Dish night. The neighborhood theaters had dish night. A friend of mine, his mother still had a collection of dishes she got at the Bob White Theater. It was a good gimmick, and you might win a set of dishes, or bank night, things like that. That was in the neighborhood theaters.
Yeah, and, we talked about the downtown palaces, but in a way, the neighborhood theaters were almost more important because there was more of a sense of connection there because chances are you knew the people you were sitting next to, right?
Exactly, yeah. The Saturday kiddie matinees and and as I mentioned, the theater manager and everybody who knew everybody, and it wasn't a cold, sterile corporate experience, kind of like now. But again, as I mentioned, you remember who you were with and the theater you saw it at. And I'm sure you probably recall something like that, too.
No, I can remember the different theaters when I saw different movies. I know exactly the theater I was at, and like you said, who I was with. We only have about 5 minutes left, Gary, so I wanted to leave you with this. Why is it so important to preserve that part of the movie experience when it comes to the old movie theaters? Why do you think it's important to preserve that?
Well, it's a feeling of unity within yourself and with your friends, and with the presentations, if they're good, to just involve the theater experience itself. There are some very nice, modern, clean theaters, that's fine. But you just want to feel part of something, just as though if you walked into a palace in the 20s, I think. It's a feeling that you'll remember, that not only will you remember the movie, but you'll remember that whole experience.
Well, Gary, it's just great talking to you. Once again, you and I are friends from way back. I would love to have you come back, and maybe we talk about, when we talk about movies, you mentioned Omnimax, and all this stuff. I would love to talk about what was CinemaScope, what was VistaVision, when you see those little...
Oh, boy.
What were some of the formats of the movies? And then Cinerama, when it came out. I worked at a Cinerama theater after Cinerama had come and gone, but the theater was still called Cinerama. And the projectionist used to just regale me with stories of the three projectors hitting the screen at once with the thing. But I would love to have you come back and just talk about, movie formats and how
Sure.
those have changed, and how now, when we go to the movie, we're not really watching film, we're watching digital, right?
Yes, which actually is very nice and clean and very convenient now. But of course, I'm a film person, and if I still love the photochemical rich texture process of film. So, but that's another subject for another day.
Well, I'm going to have you back. We're going to talk about that. Once again, my guest, Gary Locker. And Gary, it was a pleasure. And this was a great KOIN conversation. Thank you for joining us. And we'll be talking to you again. Okay, take care, everybody.